You will now be interpreting in Mr. Barstow's 12th grade World History class. The students are studying about the effects of World War II on the Soviet Union.
All right. Anyway, the end of World War II came. Probably the Soviet Union was, without a doubt, the most strongly impacted of all the nations or countries involved. The Soviet Union and then Russia. To give you an idea, and these are figures that were released by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II to the United Nations. Since these were released in 1945, most people say they've been doctored. And I'll explain what I mean by doctored in a little bit. This, like I said, was reported by the Soviets during what they called World War II, the Great Patriotic War. Between 20 and 30 million dead. That would be mainly civilian, not all military, obviously. Total or partial destruction of 1,700 towns, 70,000 villages. There again, the distinction between town and village would be a demographic distinction, like probably population. Anything under 2,000 would be a village. Anything over 2,000 would be a town. So that's what that refers to. 6 million buildings, 84,000 schools, 43,000 libraries, 31,000 factories, 1,300 bridges, 137 tractors, 49,000 combines, 7 million horses, 17 million cattle, 20 million hogs, and 27, and I just threw in 3 sheep, just for the heck of it. Now, reactions to that.
Not funny if you're a sheep.
Yeah, I wouldn't be laughing if I was a sheep, I know. But what, just initial reaction to those numbers?
Sincerely aghast.
Sincerely aghast? Yeah. No, like I said, no other country, with the possible exception of Germany. Mainly because the depth of penetration of the Wehrmacht. I mean, they got to Leningrad, they got within 15 kilometers of Moscow. In the south of Russia, it was even further. And also the enmity and the acrimony that existed between the Soviets and the Germans. They hated each other. That hatred and loathing had gone back, well, even when you saw it yesterday in Kaplan's film, The Battle on the Ice. And so the war on the Eastern Front was a total war. It was incredibly vicious. There was no humanity there. There was no Geneva. If you were a prisoner, you were dead. Yeah, Ben?
If the Soviets followed the scorched earth policy, they probably destroyed a lot of their own stuff.
Okay, good question. And taking into the thing is, if the Soviets followed a scorched earth policy, in other words, as they pulled back from the Germans, and they mentioned it yesterday, they blew up dams, they blew up buildings. So a lot of this damage is not necessarily attributed to the Wehrmacht of the German forces. The Soviets did it themselves. I'm sure what they would say, whether you blow up a bridge yourself to prevent the Germans from advancing, or they blow it up. The point is the bridge is gone. One thing that a lot of people in the United States don't pay too much attention to is this, the number of livestock that was lost. In an agrarian society, where probably still 60% of the people relied on producing the food themselves and their farms and stuff, man, a lot of people were starving to death. I mean, famine, food shortages were massive. Yeah.
Russia's factories and things were behind the times then.
Okay.
And then, with the war destroying stuff, they're still behind.
It's still there today. If you want to see the effects of World War II on the Soviet Union, go to Russia today. Boris Yeltsin will still tell you a lot of his problems don't result from what's occurred in the last 2 or 3 years, but what happened from 1939 to 1945. Or if you really were a pessimist, you'd go all the way back to World War I. These people have not had a chance to catch their breath, except for the brief period during in the 50s. One thing that the Russians did, and the United States stood by and let them, was they had wholesale, what should I say, confiscation of industrial might of Czechoslovakia, Germany, Poland. They loaded whole factories, whole cities, heavy industry onto Russian trains and shipped it back and started their own factories. So they shredded Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe. They looted it effectively. Now, I'm sure the Russians would say, hey, we didn't loot it. We're just taking back what you guys destroyed. And it did help to a certain extent. But it's still, you're talking about an infrastructure here that you just cannot recreate overnight. Yeah? No. To answer your question, they didn't see that. Obviously, the Czechs had been taken over when Hitler marched into the Sudetenland. He went in there because there were Germans along the border. So yes, he suppressed the Czechs. But the Russians, I don't think, ever saw the Czechs, or maybe the Slovaks, if they were Slavic. But the Poles, even though they were Slavic, they didn't feel any special kindred to them. It was still Russian for Russians, and you guys can finish on the seconds. So no, Eastern Europe, and the relationship between Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, even after World War II, is not a partnership. All right, it is a very subservient one, even to the point in the 1980s when there would be like if the Russians would take grain from Hungary and send back really poor quality gas, which was a terrible quid pro quo. But there again, you don't like it, try and rebel from us. So that relationship between Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union is going to go on now. Major problem in the Soviet Union, and I showed that to you, Katie, when I read you. The worst thing about communism was you had to live with all these people you don't know. All the houses that were destroyed. They still have a major housing shortage in the Soviet Union. Russia, yeah.
So, I'm wondering, for like the cattle, what percentage of all the Soviets' cattle were destroyed?
Okay, as far as percentages, of total cattle population, it's a good question. I would say probably anywhere from 35 to 40%. Okay, and that's sort of a bulk. Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
That's going to be a more important figure relative to the human population at the time.
Yeah. There again, the cattle, where they were milk producing or whether you produced them for meat, most cattle at this time were used for not so much for meat, which was rare. Even today, if you go to the Commonwealth in the United States, if you had meat once a week, it was rare, and then it's some kind of sausage and maybe some chicken. So you won't have beef. So the beast of burden, it was very important. Plowing, still in the 1940s, they were using the cattle to pull their stuff. Hogs, once again, was important for butchering, and there again, sheep. There again, it was used for wool. It was used for a number of items, not so much for killing for. In other words, they were seen as a replenishable resource, not necessarily killing. But these things, all right, can be rebuilt, can be replaced, but probably the biggest loss, and there again, in any war, is, and you may not be able to see this too well. This is out of your book. And this is Soviet war losses. And what it is it looks at the population. And so Soviet war losses in World War II were about 20 million. That has been upwardly revised to around 35 million now. Because we found out about 3 years ago that the Soviets lied about the number of people died during World War II. Some people in the United States said they're exaggerating those numbers. Not that many people died. As it turns out, they were downplaying it. They lied. There were actually more people killed. Why? Go ahead. Both of you are fairly correct. Powerful, they knew what they were doing, but what was their biggest fear in 1945?
They didn't want the world to know that their troops were wiped out.
There were elements in the American Army, General George Patton, that really didn't want to stop at Germany. He realized that the Soviet Union was going to be our opponent after World War II, and he would have liked to kept right on marching to Moscow. He knew that he could. Unfortunately, peacemongers like Eisenhower and people like that wanted to get out and get our boys home and start building the suburbs as quickly as possible.
Feedback in ASL. Have a seat, relax, feedback to each other, ASL, please.